Hello and welcome to the first recording of Module 3. So Module 3 is another one of our kind of foundations modules before we move into our study of environmental issues. And in this module, we are going to introduce evolution, the process of evolution, introduce some of the mechanisms that cause evolution in populations, and then discuss the link between evolution and biodiversity. We will, once we establish that link, we will look at biodiversity from a variety of different perspectives, including considering the function of biodiversity, how biodiversity is distributed globally, and what some of the current threats to biodiversity are, in addition to attempts to conserve or preserve biodiversity. In this first part of Module 3, we are focusing on the, excuse me, my pen's freezing up here. So in the first part of Module 3, we are focusing on the evolution portion of this module. And I will break this up into two separate recordings to make it a bit more digestible. In this first recording, we're going to define evolution and start to talk about some of the mechanisms for evolution. The emphasis in this recording will be on the process of natural selection, which is a mechanism for evolution that is non-random and produces adaptations in populations over time. We'll pick up in the next recording by introducing some of the other mechanisms for evolution, things like genetic drift, which are random mechanisms and so cause change in populations in a very different way. In that second recording, we'll also be talking a bit about evolution on a broader scale and looking at the pace of evolution over the history of life on Earth. And we'll consider the relationship between evolution and extinction and compare how that's played out in the past versus how it is playing out in the present. Okay, so evolution is a really important concept within any course that is considering topics related to the study of life. An understanding of evolution is key in making sense of what we know about the natural world. It's one of the best supported and most illuminating concepts in science. As a famous evolutionary biologist, Dobzhansky says, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, meaning that understanding this process provides us a framework through which we can make sense of the observations we have of the natural world and the data we've collected about the natural world. Evolution, simply put, just describes change over time, a process of change over time. Biological evolution, what we'll be referring to here, refers more specifically to a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time, such that within a population, gene frequencies change from generation to generation, all right? We'll focus primarily on changes at the level of population. But when these changes build up over time, they can ultimately lead to the evolution of new species, which is a process I'll talk a bit more about. And that is the process that accounts for the diversity of life on Earth as we know it. Now, understanding how populations and species kind of adapt to their environment and change over time, of course, is a huge topic. And in an intro biology course, we would be spending much more time on evolution. For environmental studies here, I'm just giving a broader, more general overview because it's still important in how we consider and study and think about a lot of aspects of environmental science. But I just wanted to put that caveat here because we're not going to go into as much detail as we would in an intro bio course. But when we consider issues related to agriculture, the evolution of pesticide resistance, genetically modified organisms, managing endangered species, issues related to environmental health, We can't really fully discuss and fully grasp those issues without a basic understanding of the nature of evolution. So I have this image of a sword-billed hummingbird in the opening slide. And this is a hummingbird that is found in the tropics, and the sword-billed part of their name references this extremely long bill they have. It's one of the largest bills of any bird in proportion to their body length. And it actually comes with some disadvantages. You might notice here that this bird has a feather out of place here. The length of that bill makes it difficult for the bird to preen its feathers, which is one of the functions of bills in birds. So why does this bird have this particular shaped bill and this particular size bill? Well, it might not make all that much sense until you see this hummingbird feed. And this hummingbird, this particular species, has evolved to specialize on the feeding of this particular mallow family that's also found in the tropics. And the structure of this flower is such that the nectaries, the structures that contain nectar that hummingbirds feed on, is located all the way at the base of this long tube. In addition to this long bill, these hummingbirds have a tongue that they'll stick out from that bill to lap up nectar. So when a hummingbird, flies into a flower like this and approaches it, that bill is this perfect match with that flower in a way that allows that hummingbird to feed in an efficient manner. This benefits the flower as well, because in the process of feeding, that hummingbird picks up pollen and presumably distributes or drops off that pollen to the next flower that it visits. Okay, just an example of an adaptation. We'll see many, many more. Now, we're not going to go into the whole sort of history of evolutionary thought here, just in the interest of time, but it's worth mentioning that the theory of evolution by natural selection specifically was proposed by Darwin in his publication on The Origin of Species. Much of what we now know about evolution has happened between Darwin's time and present day. We needed to understand genetics, for example, in a way that Darwin didn't at the time. We needed to understand the structure of a DNA molecule and patterns of heredity and all of those sorts of concepts to fully understand how evolution works. So in that respect, Darwin was a little bit ahead of his time. But he was struck to develop a theory that could explain these observations that he had made about the nature of life. He was struck by the ways in which organisms seem to be very well suited for their environment. So the hummingbird isn't a good example of that, right? That particular hummingbird has these traits that allow them to feed in a particular way. Plants that live in a tropical rainforest have broader leaves than plants that live in a desert, right? They're adapted to different moisture environments. So in his travels around the world, he was impressed by all of these different ways that organisms seem to match their environment. And at the same time, he was struck by the many shared characteristics of life. So those things that, all living things share in common, right? The characteristics that all life does, right? We all require energy. We all grow and develop. We all regulate an internal environment, even as the external environment is changing. All life is made of cells, and there are certain similarities between those cells that are shared among all living things. So he was impressed by both the shared characteristics of life and also the rich diversity of life, how much variation there is among and between Earth's different creatures. So once again, these are small examples here, but just as one little example, this is a long-legged beetle that is native to deserts in Africa, specifically Namibia. And it has this unique behavioral adaptation. The very little moisture that is found in these deserts comes in the form of fog. So these beetles have evolved to climb to the crest of a dune and basically stand on their heads in a particular way that allows them to collect beads of water on their body. That fog condenses into droplets of dew, and they're essentially, drinking from that as it trickles down. So again, just an incredible example of an adaptation, but beetles in particular are a very diverse group of insects. So this is just one type of insect, and there's almost 400,000 different described species of beetles. So again, they have these shared characteristics just of beetles, right? Having a hard exoskeleton, having 2 pairs of wings, the front pair being hardened. These are things that differentiate them from other types of insects, right? These shared characteristics. And then there's this incredible amount of diversity within the group. So how do we explain that? And again, that is what Darwin was motivated to understand. Okay, so if evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time, we can then look at what causes evolution. And these are really 2 different questions here, right? So evolution is both a pattern and a process, right? So we can look at the pattern of evolution as it's documented in the fossil record, but then we can ask, how does evolution happen, right? And so these are some of the mechanisms that cause evolution, and they each work in quite different ways. And we'll emphasize that. So I'm going to start by introducing how natural selection causes evolution. And then we'll look at a process where humans act as a selective force to cause evolution. That's a process known as artificial selection. And again, in the next recording, I'll also introduce you to some random processes that can cause evolutionary change. We're not going to talk as much about mutation and gene flow. I'll briefly mention them, but we'll focus on the process of genetic drift. Your book introduces a whole variety of other examples. For example, these green anoles in Florida that are evolving in response to the introduction of a non-native species that made its way to Florida from Cuba. These species compete for the same food, and in the past have hunted in the same area of trees for food. The non-native brown anole is kind of winning out. It's kind of pushing the green anole out of its niche, sort of higher up in the tree. Over time, in response to this selective pressure, there's evidence that green anoles are evolving larger toe pads, because those individuals that have larger toe pads have a higher probability of surviving when competing with this other species of lizard, because that trait allows them to feed more efficiently at higher portions of the tree to kind of grip onto the thinner branches higher up in the tree. Okay, so that would be something that's occurring through natural selection. Now, I will give you a kind of 1-sentence definition of natural selection, but I want to walk you through the logic of it. And again, I have this definition written later, but I'll just state it now. So natural selection is a process that causes evolution. And more specifically, it's a process by which organisms that are best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce at a higher rate than less well-adapted individuals, okay? So that results in a greater representation in the next generation of individuals with better adapted traits. Okay, but once again, to understand this, I want to sort of talk you through the process of natural selection as a series of observations and inferences. And this is essentially how Darwin laid out this process in The Origin of Species. So we begin with the observation that species tend to produce more offspring than is necessary to replace the parents and maintain the population, right? So if every family just of any species just had 2 kids per family, the population would be stable. It wouldn't be decreasing, but it wouldn't be increasing either. In populations like bacteria, seen here, they grow very, very rapidly, doubling their population size, in very short time intervals. You might recognize this graph from previous discussions as an example of exponential growth. Of course, it's not just bacteria. We could look at mushrooms like this one that produce thousands and thousands and thousands of spores, but we're not being taken over by mushrooms. Sea urchins in the ocean that release thousands and thousands of egg and sperm that can fertilize each other, right? We're not being taken over by sea urchins, okay? So most populations of most species are producing more offspring than are necessary just to maintain the population rate. So we know about the transition from exponential to logistic growth, right? So here's those bacteria again, and they had been growing exponentially. And we introduced in the previous module the concept of carrying capacity, right? So we know that exponential growth cannot continue indefinitely, and a population's growth rate slows down as it approaches carrying capacity, all right? So despite all of this offspring making, all of these fungi, all these sea urchins, all these bacteria, adult populations do stay fairly constant, right? Populations grow up to carrying capacity and maybe kind of hover around carrying capacity, but generally speaking, under sort of normal natural conditions, population sizes stay pretty constant. So where are all those offspring going? What happens to all those extra fungal spores? Well, we know that they don't all survive, right? So not every spore of that mushroom is going to land in an environment that's suitable for germination growth, right? And that is because of a concept we already introduced in the ecology unit. The idea that natural resources are limited, right? So at some point, the environment is going to sort of check back on population growth, right? Once again, as that population reaches carrying capacity. So from those observations, we can make an inference, right? So the inference is that there is some struggle for existence. So more offspring are being born than can survive, and there are limited resources, right? So this means that not every individual survives as a result of that resource limitation, right? And this can be a variety of different factors. I said in the last module a couple of times, I talked about the overlap of evolution and ecology, right? So that's what we're seeing here. And so individuals might survive because they're eaten by a predator. Individuals might survive because of competition for food or competition for water. We know that disease is a density dependent factor. Some organisms just can't tolerate certain physiological or environmental conditions. Some survive, but can't find a mate, right? They're not able to compete with other individuals for access to a mate, and so they remain unmated. Okay, so we're going to come back to that inference, but I want to add another observation. The other observation is that individuals in a population vary. So whether we're talking about humans or penguins or burrowing owls or ladybugs or a particular species of mushroom, we know that there's phenotypic variation that we can see with our own eyes, whether that's variation in shape or size, color morphs, the size of spots on the back of these ladybird beetles, whatever it may be. Individuals in a population vary with respect to, in many cases, many different traits. Now, much of that variation is heritable. Not all of it, right? But much of it is. So generally speaking, a lot of the variation we see in populations, offspring get from their parents, okay? There's all sorts of variation that's not heritable, right? So if I were to go to a tanning bed, every day for the next couple months, I could change the color of my skin, right? And so that would look like phenotypic variation. I would look a different color, a different shade, whatever it may be. But that's not heritable. That's not going to change the skin tone of any potential offspring that I would have. Now, Darwin didn't understand the basics of, or the nature of how this information is inherited. Gregor Mendel ultimately worked out the basic principles of inheritance, but he didn't publish his work until some years after The Origin of Species was published by Darwin. So we understand this much better now. Darwin was just pointing to, farm animals and plants and just noting, like, we don't know exactly how this information gets transmitted from generation to generation, but we know that offspring look like their parents, right? That was sort of Darwin's points. We now know those principles of inheritance, and genes are the hereditary material carried in our cells. So our cells have DNA molecules, and there are regions of a DNA molecule that specify the production of a particular protein and that influence an individual's trait. So again, we understand now the genetic basis of the fact that much of the variation we see is heritable. Okay, so let's take this all together now. So our second inference is that struggle for existence that I mentioned earlier, the fact that there are more offspring born than can survive, that struggle for existence is not random, but selective. In other words, going back to this image here, those individuals that are eaten or that starve or that are diseased or that remain unmated, on average, are not a random subset of the population. They are individuals with certain traits that prevented them from competing for food or avoiding a predator or having resistance to a disease, okay? So by selective here, we mean that those individuals with the best sets of traits for that environment will have the best chance of survival and reproduction. You may have also heard of this idea in terms of the phrase survival of the fittest. Fittest in this context refers to the probability of an individual surviving and reproducing. It doesn't refer to our concept of physical fitness. So the fittest individual in a population is the individual that had the greatest number of surviving offspring. Okay. One of the kind of classic textbook examples of how natural selection works is of these two color morphs of a particular type of moth that's found in Europe. These are known as the peppered moth. And depending on your screen resolution, you may or may not see how well camouflaged these moths are. So this is, again, a single species of moth, but it has natural variation, right? It comes in, there's phenotypic variation. So there's this lighter colored morph and the darker colored morph, right? And then in this image on the right here, here's our lighter colored morph, and here's the darker colored morph. And you can see against these two backgrounds how these different color morphs may function in terms of camouflage. And presumably when a moth is well camouflaged, it has a better probability of evading being eaten by a predator, therefore a higher probability of surviving and reproducing. So this is a particular case study of natural selection that was first documented actually in the 1800s in London. And a naturalist at the time noted that he had caught this black morph, which at that time had been very rare. So most of the population was this lighter colored morph, which constituted something like 98% of the population. What was rare in the early 1850s became very, very common over the next 15 years. So by 1900, the situation completely reversed, And by that time, the population was up to over 98% of the dark morphs. And initially, scientists didn't really know what was happening. And to understand what was happening, we need to sort of know what changes are occurring in the environment. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was very common for city trees to be covered with these lichens. And the sort of white portion of the bark that you can see here is made up of lichen, which is a symbiotic organism that is part fungus, part photosynthetic partner. So where the trees are covered in lichen, obviously the lighter morph blends in really well, and the darker morph stands out, and so it has a higher probability of being eaten. What changed between these two images here, what changed over this 50 to 100-year period, was pollution. So England was experiencing the Industrial Revolution, factories were being built, and there was significant air pollution at that time that was well documented. There was kind of a dark smoke that covered and surrounded the countryside. Lichen are pretty sensitive to air pollution and air conditions, so they started to die back. So trees that had been light and covered by lichens were now dark and bare, like the one you can see in this image. And so we now understand that over time, the dark morph was better adapted to those conditions, because now in this new environment, they had a higher probability of surviving. So it's an interesting case study. We now know that, of course, the color of morphs is a genetic trait. So moths pass their color to the next generation. And we now know that this change in the genetic makeup of the population over time was a result of natural selection. It has actually, by the way, changed back. So in the last 50 years, most industrial countries have significantly reduced their pollution. And so the number of dark morphs has now dropped as the forests are becoming cleaner. This is a phenomenon known as industrial melanism. And I'd encourage you to look up some other examples of that. There's some interesting examples. Okay, so I elaborated on that example to show or to demonstrate inference 3, that populations change over time as the frequency of advantageous traits increase, okay? So this is a simplified version of the peppered moth example, where again, in generation 1, kind of pre-industrial revolution, you have a population that's made up primarily of the light morphs. Over time, as the environment changes and the tree trunks are no longer that lichen colored background, birds find it easier to find and hunt on moths, right? So by generation 2, based on the survivors of generation 1, we have a higher proportion of the dark morphs in the population, and kind of rinse, wash, and repeat, and that changes over time, okay? But the environment plays a starring role in all of this. As I alluded to, now times 100 years and many, many generations later, this pattern looks very different, and the white morph is more common now. Okay, so taking that all together, the series of observations and inferences, the idea behind natural selection is that individuals with certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Over time, natural selection increases the frequency of adaptations that are favorable in an environment, right? And so this is what explains that match between organisms and their environment that Darwin spoke about. But as I just said with the moth example, this is a very dynamic process, right? Because if the environment changes, what is adaptive may change. So natural selection can drive adaptation to new and different conditions. And over much longer periods of time, this can give rise to new species. So in the examples I've talked about so far, we're talking about within a species, right? Change over time in a population. But we'll look at how ultimately new species can evolve. Okay, so you have a couple more examples to look over in your textbook to kind of drive this idea home. And then I want to make just a couple other general comments about how natural selection works in a population. So once again, when the environment presents a selective force, a selective pressure, that's some non-random influence that affects who survives or reproduces. This could be a new predator, a change in a food supply, changing temperatures, right? And I'd encourage you to, again, add to that list. What are some other examples of selective forces? So when the environment presents a selective force, natural selection is the primary force by which populations adapt. So those survivors who have the genetic traits that enable them to survive in their changing environment pass on those traits, right? And that's how gene frequencies change over time from generation to generation. So just another example, it's not saying anything different than I've said before, but we have beetles here instead of moths that are resting on a tree, and there is variation in a population, right? So one prerequisite to natural selection is that there is genetic variation, right? Individuals possess these inherited differences, okay? A bird comes along, a predator comes along and eats some individuals in this population, right? It's going to eat those individuals that it has the easiest time finding, right? That are the easiest ones to pick off. So individuals with the less favorable trait, in this case, the darker beetles that stand out in the tree trunk are more likely to be eaten and so have fewer opportunities to reproduce. So that leads to what we call differential reproductive success. And it sounds like a mouthful, but all that is saying is that individuals in a population reproduce at different rates. So not everyone will survive to reproduce, and those that do will produce varying numbers of offspring. Okay, such that in the next generation, in this example, there are fewer dark individuals that are born. So gene frequencies have changed. There's a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. That is evolution, okay? Now we can follow this through over many generations. Over time, the population may be mostly made up of just tan individuals. Or perhaps the environment will change in some way that the darker morphs now have some selective advantage in a changing environment, right? So that aspect of natural selection is not predictable because we don't necessarily know what the environment will look like in the future. Now, in the real world, natural selection can operate in a variety of different ways, and in doing so can have different impacts on populations. And I'm going to just introduce you to 3 different mechanisms for natural selection. And for each of these, I'm going to show you 3 more graphs. So we're starting with an original population. So you can think about this as, kind of generation 1. And we're looking at a range of a phenotype here. So these are beetles of different colors from, light to dark. And the number of individuals with each of those traits, So you can see a standard bell curve here. So most of the individuals in the population have this average colored trait. And then it decreases from there. So as you get to really light or really dark, there are many fewer individuals with that trait, okay? So we're going to throw a selective force at this population. And again, the idea here is that natural selection can have different outcomes depending on, what varieties in the population the environment either favors or selects against. So we're comparing now the original population that we saw up here with an evolved population. So this would be generation 2 or 3 or 4 or so on and so forth. And in this scenario, natural selection has selected against the extreme versions of that trait. So it's selected against the light morph, against the dark morph, right? This is consistent with actually the example that we looked at previously on those trees. So the presumption here is that all the trees are tan beetles are favored. They're not hunted at the same rate that the light and dark morphs are. This is a form of natural selection that's referred to as stabilizing selection, and this favors the averages, right? This is a very, very common mode of natural selection. Human baby weights are a great example of this, right? We have an average weight that most newborns cluster around, and there tends to be more significant issues with infants that are either extremely low weights or extremely high weights, right? So we sort of converged around an average form. It's a very common mode of natural selection, but it's not the only way that natural selection works. Under different environmental conditions, we can see what's referred to as directional selection, where natural selection is favoring a particular extreme of a trait. So in this case, natural selection selected against the lighter morphs and selected for the darker morphs. So it pushes the average value of the trait in one direction. So this is when populations get, generally bigger over time, or darker over time, or lighter over time, right? It pushes it in one direction. So if the trees, like in the industrial melanism example, kind of darkened from pollution, we would expect darker beetles to be favored. Okay. The third mode of natural selection is what's called disruptive selection. This is kind of the opposite of stabilizing selection, where natural selection selects against the average value of a trait and favors not just one extreme, but both extremes. All right, so it's selecting against the average or against the intermediate forms. So in this case, if we were in a forest where there were both light and dark colored trees, we would expect both light and dark colored beetles to preferentially survive. The light colored beetles are going to hang out on the light tree and have higher rates of survival and reproduction in that environment. The darker beetles are going to hang out on the dark trees and have higher rates of survival and reproduction in that environment. The medium colored beetles are going to stand out on both tree types and be selected against. This is, again, a predator-prey kind of example here, but other types of selective forces would work in a similar way. Okay, so these are just different ways that natural selection can operate in a population, and each of these it does have different consequences ultimately for the genetic diversity of a population over time. And that's a really key part of all of this. I've mentioned genetic variation quite a few times already as one of these prerequisites to natural selection, right? So the ability of a population to adapt is largely dependent on its genetic diversity, right? So genetic diversity refers to diversity at the level of a gene, and more specifically, the variation and frequency of alleles in a population. Okay, so the heritable variation among individuals of a single population, or we can think about it among a species, or we could characterize it for a species as a whole, right? And again, this is just something that varies from population to population and species to species. So as humans, we actually have a lot of phenotypic variation, right? Individual humans can look quite different from each other, but as a species, like relatively low genetic diversity. There are species like Adelaide penguins and houseflies that to our eyes all look identical to each other, but they have like 20 times the amount of genetic diversity that humans have. So one's not better or worse, it's just that it's something that differs between different species. Now, there are two main sources of genetic variation. So why do humans have different genetic diversity than houseflies or Adelaide penguins? Well, there are two processes that contribute to genetic variation, and so therefore are really important with respect to evolution. The first is the process of mutation. Mutation is a random process that changes the DNA sequence of cells. And again, I'm going over the basics of this, so I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail, but mutation can happen in a variety of different ways. It alters the nucleotide base sequence of a DNA molecule, and it can do that through deleting a base pair, inserting a base pair, substituting a base pair. However it occurs, it changes that underlying sequence. Mutations most of the time are what we call neutral, meaning they alter the DNA sequence, but they don't affect the organism. It doesn't change the protein that's being made or translated. And that is for a variety of reasons, but one reason is that, our genetic code has a lot of built-in redundancy. So there can be changes to that underlying recipe that don't actually change what's made. Of mutations that do have an effect, the majority of those are harmful. So if a mutation does alter a gene in a way that changes the protein that's going to be made, that's usually not a good thing. But every once in a while, a beneficial mutation pops up where the DNA is altered in a way that transcribes different RNA that translates to a different protein, and the organism benefits as a result of that. Now, mutations are relatively rare events, and most of them are neutral. But over time, this is the source of genetic variation that natural selection is essentially sorting through, right? It is important to keep in mind that mutations occur and have the potential to occur in all of our cells. But from an evolutionary perspective, the only mutations that matter are the ones that occur in our sex cells and our reproductive cells that produce egg and sperm, right? Because those are the ones that get passed on from generation to generation. So I might have a mutation in one of my skin cells as a result of UV exposure, and I can change the underlying genetic sequence of that skin cell can be altered as a result of that mutation, but there is no mechanism for me to pass that on to offspring. Okay. Now, the other form of genetic variation comes from genetic recombination. And so this is the process of sexual reproduction that shuffles alleles and creates new combinations in offspring, right? So mutation introduces genetic variation, and sexual reproduction shuffles variation to come up with all brand new allelic combinations. If you've taken a biology course, then you know a bit more about the process of meiosis that generates our gametes. I'm not going to kind of get into the details here, but just to give you an idea of the importance of sexual reproduction in increasing genetic diversity. In humans, having 23 chromosomes that assort independent of one another when we are undergoing meiosis to produce egg and sperms, there's essentially 8 million possible chromosome combinations to make an egg. That's 2 to the 23rd because of our 23 chromosomes. And then another 8 million possible chromosome combinations when making a sperm, again, to the 23rd. So anytime a sperm fertilizes an egg, it's 1 in 8 million times 1 in 8 million. That comes up to 64 trillion different diploid combinations. Okay. So again, if you've taken a bio course, you'll get into a bit more of the mechanistic detail of this, but that's the basic idea. Okay, so I think we've driven this point home. I'd encourage you to just briefly look over this example from your textbook. It's another example of evolution in action, where natural selection produces populations with different gene frequencies, again, with the prerequisite of genetic variation. And this example is of a rock pocket mouse that's found on different colored rocky outcroppings in the desert Southwest. So it's an interesting example of adaptation to different environments and another type of predator-prey example. So in this example, it's predatory owls that are likely the selective pressure that has selected for different coat colors in different habitat types. So lots of predator-prey examples. So you can see how important that relationship is to evolution. And we spoke a bit about that in the ecology unit. Okay, couple more points, and then I'm going to wrap up this recording and we'll go on over to part 2. Now, evolution typically is not occurring in isolation. So coevolution is a process where two species provide the selective pressures that determine which traits are favored by natural selection in the other species. And I'm introducing the idea of coevolution here because it can be a problem or an issue when species that did not co-evolve together suddenly share a habitat. So for example, we'll be looking at the impact of introduced or invasive species. And these are typically species that have not overlapped during their evolutionary history, but sort of are suddenly brought together. So kind of two key concepts here. One is that two species can become highly adapted to one another when each becomes the selective pressure that favors certain traits in the other. That's coevolution, like the hummingbird and the mallow flower I showed you. But again, species that don't have that history, that never co-evolved with a particular competitor or a particular predator, may not have the traits needed to survive if that species invades their habitat. So I already mentioned the hummingbird example a couple times now, and I've defined coevolution. And once again, lots of predator and prey examples of that, but we're going to come back in a few different contexts to the issue of invasive species. And non-native species can often cause significant ecological damage. They can cause human health problems, and they often come with a really serious economic price tag as well. We'll talk more at the end of this module about the causes of biodiversity loss, and invasive species are one of the leading causes of species endangerment worldwide, which is why I'm mentioning this process to you in this context. Okay, I skipped over that. It's another example in your book you can briefly look at, but I'm going to move on to the main point that I want to make. Okay, so in thinking about invasive species and this sort of issue of coevolution, I want to define two more terms. One is the concept of endemism. So a species that is endemic is native to a particular area and not found anywhere else on Earth. All right. So if you're following along with your textbook, you are following along with the case study of bird species in Guam that were driven to extinction with the introduction of a non-native snake. So some of these are bird species that are found on other islands, but many of them are endemic. They're found nowhere else in the world. I'll talk a little bit more about California when we talk about biodiversity, but California is a biodiversity hotspot in part because we in California have such high levels of endemism. Again, species found in California and nowhere else in the world. And so it's these types of endemic species that can often be at high risk with the introduction of a non-native species. So an invasive species is a type of non-native species, right? So meaning it evolved somewhere else and has been introduced to a new environment. Not all non-native species are necessarily invasive, but many are. So invasive species are ones whose introduction goes on to cause some type of ecological, economic, or environmental harm, okay? So the brown tree snake in Guam has contributed to the decline of many bird species, and so is considered an invasive species. Invasive species management, again, is a topic that we'll come back to. This example on the right here is an invasive mongoose on the Hawaiian Islands. Kind of like Guam, our Hawaiian Islands have experienced really dramatic declines in bird populations. And most of the birds that are adapted to Hawaii have not co-evolved with ground predators. So they have not evolved the types of defenses that would be needed to avoid predation from, mammals who primarily live on the ground. So in Hawaii, it's primarily the ground nesting birds and turtles that have been most susceptible to invasive mammals like this mongoose, who's a skilled predator that, knows how to hunt on eggs in their hatchlings. Okay, so again, these are all concepts that we're going to come back to. But I just want to sort of introduce the basics of it now. We'll differentiate moving forward between extinction and extirpation. So extinction refers to the loss of a particular species globally, meaning it's gone, it's off the face of the planet of our Earth. Extirpation, to say a species has been extirpated, is to say that it's locally extinct. Meaning it's extinct in one geographic area, but it's still found elsewhere. So some of the birds of Guam that I mentioned were found on other islands. So it's still concerning if they've been extirpated from Guam, but it's not necessarily the same level of concern as species that have gone extinct. With extirpated species, at least there can be still some hope of recovery. Okay, I'm going to end this recording here. This is a little bit on the longer side, but these are some important foundational topics. Part 2 will be shorter. I'm going to briefly introduce some of the other mechanisms that cause evolution and then talk a bit about the nature of extinction. So be sure to watch Part 2 before you move on to the biodiversity portion of Module 3.